All right, well, welcome to week 3. This is going to be lecture 2. And I want to jump right back into where we were when we finished the last set of lectures. So on your PowerPoint, you need to go to the disruption mindset and resilience. See, the disruption mindset, as Charlene talks to us about it, presupposes resilience over robustness. And that's what I mean by that is how we are defining it. See, robustness assumes tried and true, and it will last forever. But resilience prefers contextual adaptivity, meaning it surveys the ecosystem and recognizes that as the ecosystem shifts and changes around us, the context that we do what we do shifts and changes around us, and we've got to be able to be adaptive in those new ecosystems, or as in business world would say, as the market share begins to shift and change. We value creativity, ongoing assessment of ourselves, reflection on our congregation, and then the assessment of the broader community. And it requires us, I think resilience does, the dance with the Holy Spirit, because it really means that the Holy Spirit has to lead the way in this entire process. Now, when we talk about fostering disruptive thinking within the context of the church and the changes that means, I think we need to say what it doesn't do, right? Fostering disruption thinking is not about this sadistic enjoyment of change. Some people are just love change, they love to innovate, they like to try new things. But when you bring that into an organization, especially like a church, it can feel painful and unnecessary at times. So disruptive thinking is not just about scratching the itch we have to do different things. And it's not about finding some sort of consumer-driven relevancy, right? That was the church growth model of the 80s and 90s. And not that didn't bear fruit, and I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but what I'm suggesting there is that the way of adapting in the 80s and 90s was simply to cater to this consumerism that meant that we were now relevant to the communities that we found ourselves in. It's not about a devaluing of what has come before us. Too often when we think about adaptive change, and when you send change agents into churches and organizations, they talk about change as though everything that came before it was unfaithful. And we have to learn how to be able to navigate the tensions between what it was and what was relevant and contextually relevant in a time and what needs to be today. And we can celebrate the gifts, the graces, and the sacrifices that have been made in the past, even as we lean forward into the changes that need to be made in the future. And it's not about a power-tripping posture of a leader that knows better. And too often you get these people who's ego-driven. I'm reading right now a book called When Narcissism Comes to Church. And I tend to believe that can happen when leaders who are bent on, they know how to make things happen, they know how to be made things different, and they take this posture of, I am going to presume upon the organization an agenda for change that may be inconsistent with who they are, and maybe even contextually inconsistent, but they lack the capacity to listen, so they change for change's sake, based upon past experience rather than the relevancy of being in that context that they are in. We value disruption. How do we value disruption? Well, when we move from that castle to outpost, right? Disruption values the changing ecosystems that our outposts exist in. And we've kind of mentioned this already. But the communities that we exist in, they change, they transform, they are inundated by those complex convergences of economics and politics and ethnicity and immigration and racial justice and all of the various complexities that exist in a community. And as those change, where the outpost of that local church expression finds itself needs to be able to adapt to it. Disruption dislocates decision making from the hero on the top to the community leaning into this contextual adaptivity together. And I guess what I want to say there is that too often, if we're not careful, we come with a program for change rather than, and one of the things that I love about several of you in this class is that you've been in your context for a long time and you know your community, but we need to rely upon our community to help us to think through, to process what kind of changes together do we need to make. And so you need to bring people in early rather than rolling out a full change program for people that they never had buy-in in the first place. There needs to be a sense of transparency and vulnerability, a commitment to the why we are doing what we are doing, and a clarity of vision that continues to center people on the whys of the change so that our change doesn't feel merely ad hoc like we've talked about in the past. It dislocates the conversation from internal survival to external engagement. And that's what I think disruption does. When I read Charlene's Lee suggestion that we need to be completely new consumer minded, I don't read that as consumerism and marketplace. Analogous, what I mean by that is we need to look outside the doors, man. We need to do what Jesus says and look at the harvest fields that are ripe and recognizes that so many of our churches are not embodying and embedding the DNA of God's good news within those communities. And in that respect, we've lost our capacity to speak meaningfully about it. And I think it can relocate our conversations to how do we engage our communities and the people in those communities in meaningful ways. It's going to require participation and buy-in from the congregation. This can't be spearheaded by some razzle-dazzle person up front or this powerful leader who is controlling. No, it's got to be a communal endeavor and a communal effort in which we all participate to see this change occur. And it cultivates a leadership mindset and not merely a management model. I think this is really important because if we go back to that idea of leadership that Todd Bolsinger talked about, I think it was in week 2, in which he says we're pulling people together to transform ourselves as an organization so that we can meet the adaptive challenges collectively and move forward in those things. Typically, in the Newtonian construct that we talked about in week 2, we're talking about management of systems and structures that exist because they are predictable and they are standardized and they are homogeneous and they are efficient and they are productive, and so we need good managers. But I think in adaptive change, we actually need leaders. And it really truly values the fivefold gifts of the church that are present in Ephesians chapter 4. Apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, and teacher. Because I believe that all 5 of those gifts have to be present in the context of adaptive change. You have to have the apostles that can lean out into new endeavors. You've got to have the prophets who can assess the brokenness, structural and systemic in a community, and want to address it. You have to have evangelists that can speak and tell a great story. You have to have shepherds that will care for people along the change and the transformation that's taking place. And you've got to have teachers that can ensure that we are being consistent and true to who God has called us to be as the church. And all of those need to be present in the life of the congregation, and it usually can't happen just through one person. So it requires the capacity for us to bring everybody to the table. I love this quote. This is where disruptive transformation and change management differ. When you aim for disruptive transformation, the road ahead is difficult, and you must commit yourself, your organization, completely. And then she goes on to talk about fostering a movement. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about movements in the back half of this semester, the last 4 weeks. But she says some things that engages me and that I just wanted to briefly note. She says, it's the same with movements. As you prepare to let go so a movement can flourish, you also have to spend time defining its parameters. The way I talked about this is that a movement is like a powerful river running. And if you've ever noticed that rivers, alongside of rivers, cities pop up, right? Life happens. But if a river breaches its banks, it becomes a flood and it becomes devastating. One of the things that I think we have to do as leaders is we got to constantly dig out the riverbed to ensure that the river is flowing in the right directions. We've got to create the parameters. You need to set the guidelines and standards while also decentralizing and democratizing decision-making, which means you have to embed in every person the DNA and consistently coach them into the collective vision for what this movement ought to look like. You need to create unity around a central statement of purpose while also providing space for babble of voices to emerge. There's got to be this collective vision that we buy into, even as there is this harmony of voices that speak into that. And you need to remind everyone about the common vision, inspiring them to remain engaged and active rather than controlling and directing every action. There is a very strategic posture that a leader must maintain when when being a part of what God's movement needs to look like in this world. And there's going to be a tension that you're constantly living in because you don't want to be controlling, you want to be empowering, but you also know that there's things that have to be preserved to ensure the integrity of what the movement is going to look like as it exists moving forward. And then she notes three ways to build a movement. And again, I'm not going to spend much time on this because this is in the book, but I would say you've got to identify those early followers. And she talks about finding effective followers, people who think for themselves, carry out their duties and assignments with energy and assertiveness, and those who are risk takers, self-starters, and independent problem solvers. I think that's powerful. She says, write a manifesto, and for me that means clarify your why, speak about your why, and talk about your why. And then you've got to be present as a leader along the way, and she gives some ways in which you can do that, and you can check that out in her book. Starting in lecture 3 and 4, we're going to break this down even a little further, and we're going to talk a little bit about seizing upon the opportunities of this moment of disruption and disequilibrium for the sake of the movement that God is calling us to build.